Good afternoon, everybody. It's it's noon, and we're at panel number 7 in our Marijuana Law 2020 conference. The topic for this panel is marijuana, agriculture, and the environment. I personally have taught environmental law for many years, and so have been always attentive to the environmental and energy issues involved with marijuana law, and so. But it sometimes gets overlooked in the discussions of marijuana policy. And so when I just got the go-ahead to put this conference together, one thing I for certain wanted to do is to make sure that we had a panel that focused on environmental, energy, agriculture concerns. And I'm delighted with the panel that we've assembled. I think we're going to have a great conversation in the next hour and a half or so. Let me introduce our 3 panelists first. I'm going to introduce them fairly quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to them because you want to hear them speak, not me. So our first speaker is Jessica Owley, who's a professor of law and director of the environmental law program at the University of Miami Law School, where she focuses, her work focuses on climate change, among other things. In addition to a JD, she also has several master's degrees, like a whole list of them, as well as a PhD in environmental science from University of California, Berkeley. Before moving to Miami, she taught for many years at the University of Buffalo, but I figure that the climate change interests in Miami must be somewhat different from those in Buffalo. Maybe that's what you're talking about. No, she will be talking on pesticides and marijuana. Our second speaker is Ryan Stoa, who's a visiting professor of law at Southern University Law Center in Baton Rouge. Prior to that, he taught at Concordia School of Law. He writes a lot about marijuana law and its relationship to environmental law, water law, and agriculture law. And he's the author of a book that has been mentioned already in several panels of the conference called Craft Weed, Family Farming and the Future of the Marijuana Industry, published by MIT Press in 2018. And finally, Gina Warren, our third speaker, is professor of law and the George Butler Research Professor at the University of Houston Law Center, where she's taught since coming over from Texas A&M Law School in 2016. She teaches and writes about property law, energy law, oil and gas law, with a research focus on renewable energy and climate change. So Ryan will be talking on social equity in cannabis agriculture, and Gina will be talking about marijuana, energy, and the climate. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Owley now. As we go through the presentations, if people have questions for the participants, please write them into the Q&A box. And at the end of everybody's presentation, we'll move into a Q&A period, and I will relay those questions to the participants. So with no further ado, Jessica Owley.
Okay. All right, great. I hope you see my slides there, which are not fancy, and they're there, frankly, mostly to provide the transcript at the bottom in case anyone has trouble with my thick Midwestern accent or something. Thank you so much for inviting me here today, and thanks to Jay especially. I'm so excited to be on a panel with Ryan and Gina. Frankly, my work in this area would be nothing without theirs. I rely on their work so much. And I'm glad I'm going first, because then they can just correct all my mistakes as they go through in their following presentations. And as everyone I'm sure is saying throughout all the panels, I'm really sorry we couldn't be there in person, not just because this is, an enjoyable group of people, but this really changes the format of a symposium. Webinars are great, I think, because we reduce our carbon footprint. We can invite people who maybe couldn't have come before. But it really changes their function of a symposium, right? I've enjoyed listening to the sessions I've been able to attend, but I'm really missing those in-between moments during the breaks where we chat with each other and we help kind of push each other as research. So I'm really hoping we can find some way to still do that in this format. I also don't get to see look around the room and see who's shaking their head or wincing when I say things wrong. So I hope you will all feel really emboldened to send me messages or comments and suggestions. And also in true symposium fashion, I have a work in progress for you. So I really hope we can make this a dialogue about how to look at these issues. Basically, I'm going to tell you a bunch of things that I find fascinating about pesticides, and then we can think about what it all might mean together. And I am probably the person at this conference who thinks the least about marijuana. In fact, I don't ever know if I should call it cannabis or marijuana. historical panel yesterday makes me want to call it marijuana because that's cool, but then a lot of the pesticide literature uses cannabis. I'll go between the two. Feel free to swiftly and decisively correct me on what I should be using. I do, however, spend a lot of time thinking about environmental law. A lot of my work centers on land conservation, both public and private. And I fell into this topic when I was talking to land conservation organizations, land trusts, that were fielding requests to allow marijuana cultivation on their protected farmlands. And they were really concerned about what that might mean, right? Not just the implications of allowing a federally illegal activity, but also, would it change the environmental impacts or their conservation goals on the property? So I wrote about that a couple years ago, and Jay's invitation gave me a good nudge to dive into the many unanswered questions that arose for me during that project. So generally, my examination of marijuana cultivation on protected lands pushed me into thinking about how legalization of marijuana might change the environmental impacts of marijuana cultivation. So my original hypothesis, and I am not alone in this, was that the legalization of marijuana would be good from an environmental standpoint. And that is largely because illegal cultivation of marijuana is so detrimental, right? And that's true for many reasons. Probably most notably the impacts on water resources and wildlife. But I'm going to focus on just like the one issue along this continuum, which is the conundrum presented by pesticides. So pesticides in illegal grows. This is a clear, relatively well-established problem with illegal growing of pesticides, right? There's rodenticides, herbicides, and insecticides used. If you're going to grow pot illegally, why would you follow the legal rules for pesticide use? So we're using a lot of pesticides that may be illegal completely in the United States, and we're definitely using even legal pesticides in illegal ways, in places where they shouldn't be used, manners they shouldn't be used, amounts they shouldn't be used in. Notably is the rodenticides here. They are particularly toxic. We don't have to be scientists to understand that weed killer sounds dangerous, but rat poison sounds really bad, right? And there's been quite a few studies. I have this cute little guy here. This is a Pacific fisher. It's a rodent, like a weasel. Sounds cuter than saying rodent, like a little ferret. He's cute, I swear. And they are a threatened species in California, not yet federally listed, but definitely a species that is in danger. And one of the chief threats to this species is the illegal marijuana grows and the rodenticides that the growers are using to kill off the rats that eat the plants. And in fact, a study in 2015 found that 80 to 85% of all of the dead fishers that they found had been exposed to these rodenticides. So very clear kind of pesticide problem with the illegal grows. So does it get any better when we grow it legally? If we legalize marijuana cultivation, will that lead to safer use of pesticides? The answer seems to be a definite yes, but as with so many of our questions. Well, to begin with, you can see I've dropped the word rodenticide off of here, right? They are not using rodenticides for the most part. It's a different type of growing process. They also, but they do use extensive amounts of pesticides, right? There are some organic products, but pesticide use is extensive in the industry. So we've dropped off rodenticides. What else? I mean, maybe we can say with the fences and the controlled irrigation compared to this photo of kind of just the trash and the containers left around, we're going to have maybe less exposure into the groundwater or into the oil and into the soil or something like that. And maybe the workers will actually wear some level of protective equipment here, which is unlikely to be happening with the illegal grows. So picture is definitely an improvement. But I'm going to present to you some reasons why our pesticide problems are not just solved with legalization. Okay. I'm going to coarsely kind of put our concerns into two buckets. First, we care about pesticides because of their impact on the environment. Are they going to contaminate the air, soil, water? Will they be consumed by wildlife who will be harmed by them? Some of our earliest environmental laws are based on pesticide, right? Rachel Carson, Silent Spring was about the impact of DDT on wildlife. So it's been a kind of a central focus of environmental law since the beginning of the environmental era. But we also care about the impacts on people. And this could be in the handling of the pesticides, the farm workers, the marijuana trimmers, and of course, the people ingesting the marijuana, the consumers. And in the United States, pesticide regulation is centered in the federal government. So you need to know nothing more about pesticide regulation than to already realize this is going to be a problem for marijuana. Let's look at how it works. All right, so here's our federal scheme. We have two major laws that I'll discuss. There's like kind of little laws and amendments along the way, but we're just going big picture today. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is the one who's in charge here through the OPP, which is the Office of Pesticide Programs, and it regulates the manufacture and use of all pesticides in the United States. And it establishes the maximum level for pesticide residues in food. So we're going to go kind of through what this means and how it works. And let's start with the FIFRA. Oh, I didn't write out the acronym for you. I will tell you. FIFRA stands for the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. You can see why I have embraced the acronym. That is a mouthful. We'll just call it FIFRA. FDCA is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But let's start with FIFRA. It governs the registration or the labeling of pesticides. All right, so all pesticides to be legally used in the United States must be registered and must go through this process where the EPA instructs exactly kind of how that label is going to look, what the warnings are going to be, what has to be on it, right? And it is illegal to use a pesticide except in compliance with its label or registration. So EPA creates that label. You can't use a pesticide unless it's labeled, and you can't scroll down. So it's illegal to use a pesticide that's not registered, and it's illegal to use a pesticide in a way not specifically allowed by the label, okay? So here's our conundrum for us. Well, there's no labels for approved use on cannabis. So any use of these pesticides, whether registered or not, is not permissible federally, right? Sounds like a common refrain we hear for things about marijuana. A few more things to know because they'll come up later. Pesticides are categorized as general or restricted. So as you might guess from those terms, a restricted pesticide is one that's likely to have more environmental or health impacts. There's more rules on how it is to be used and administered. The restrictions can relate to things like how you spray it on, what the training is for the people who put it on, where it can be used, what pests you can use it on, those types of things. So you can picture a big long list of things that you would have for a restricted pesticide. And in particular, only people who are certified pesticide appliers, are allowed to use the restricted pesticides. Again, keep that in mind because it'll come up again for us. All right, and then the last thing is that there are a few pesticides that are exempt. So they don't require the labeling. These are often pretty benign seeming things like mint oil and citronella and stuff like that. So that's the process we go through. So what are we left with? It means that the use of pesticide on cannabis is illegal under FIFRA and theoretically punishable by civil and criminal penalties. It could also be troublesome for pesticide retailers. We heard an earlier panel, I think the first day, discuss whether sellers of fertilizers are marijuana businesses and should they be worried on that score and about RICO and things like that. But they could also get their business into trouble and potentially shut down under FIFRA. But we haven't seen anything like that happen. It's a theoretical possibility, but I haven't seen FIFRA used in that way. So I don't want to scare anyone. All right, so what are FIFRA standards for registration? Well, before the EPA can register a pesticide, the applicant has to show, among other things, that the pesticide, when used according to its label, will not generally cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. So we see it seems like an environmental standard. We're worried about the ecology. But then I want you to look at kind of the continuation of that definition, which shows us how the environmental issues and the public health issues go hand in hand, which is that the definition of unreasonable adverse effect on the environment includes not just the effect on the environment, but part two there, a human dietary risk from the residues. So this shows us how these pieces come together, that FIFRA tells the EPA to go forth and make these rules and regulations, and they're supposed to keep in mind both the kind of the potential environmental impacts and the public health impacts. All right, so registration, though, is only half the battle. We also need to look at those pesticide residues. So pesticide residues, right? This tells us like how much pesticide is okay for us to eat. And perhaps we're surprised that that answer is not 0. We define that there are actually some levels of pesticide that it's going to be okay for it to still be on our food. So you can eat that apple that still has a little bit of pesticide on it, as long as we show that it's going to be so negligible that it won't really hurt you. All right, but we must still be deemed to be safe. And what is safe? Of course, it's a reasonable certainty that no harm will result from aggregate exposure to the pesticide. And there's all these different things that they look at in determining that level. They look at the toxicity. They look at how many apples you're likely to eat. Are you going to eat apples and you're going to eat tomatoes? And will those pesticides interact with each other? Should we have better, higher levels for things that kids eat more of? Should we do special studies to see how it's going to affect pregnant women? All of those types of things go into the setting of those standards. So I hope you understand immediately kind of what a research needed, how much research you would need and how onerous the process could be. There are some exemptions here as well. So just like some pesticides are exempt from having a label, some are exempt from having a residue. Now notice that's not exactly, that doesn't, well, often those are the same pesticides. It doesn't have to be so, because there could be things that maybe we don't think there's any problem handling them, but maybe there's problem eating them. So you can just see how it's a little same idea, but some slightly different tests that you'd have to do. You know, one's like safe for the environment and worker handling versus eating. I think we can see why we might have different standards there. Biggest problem here is we just have so little research on this. We don't know what levels of are safe because no one is testing them. Very little kind of ability to get funding or approval to do research in this area. And maybe not as strong of a motivation if you can't register your pesticides for marijuana use anyways. Why would you spend time and money doing that research? It also means that any pesticide residue found is a violation of federal law because there's no residue level established. So let me break that down a little bit. So we have a list of pesticide residues that are allowable on our apples. If we eat an apple and it's got one of those pesticides on it and the residue is below, we're fine. If we eat an apple and the residue is above what's permitted, that is an illegal apple and should be seized and disposed of. If there's a pesticide on it that wasn't on that list, that is also illegal. So if it's not on the list, the tolerance level is 0. So there's no list for marijuana. So absolutely any pesticide found is illegal, right? Because those are all 0 levels. All right, so let's also think about then some implementation, enforcement, and all these fun types of ideas. The actual process for registering pesticides and setting tolerances is a fascinating and complicated journey and risk assessment. It is fraught with a considerable amount of money, lobbying money, pushing for registration. It requires a lot of data. There's a lot of lawsuits here too. There's a lot of active nonprofit organizations challenging the EPA's levels, saying that they do not think they're stringent enough, that things are exempt when they shouldn't be, that things are allowed on certain crops when they shouldn't be. You can see how this would be a very active area of litigation. It's notice and comment, slow rulemaking, regulatory process. It's also got some kind of interesting implementation and enforcement issues going on, because once the EPA sets those residue levels, it's actually the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that implements those standards. So the FDA is supposed to be monitoring actual pesticide content of all commodities. And they have the power to confiscate foods that have excess concentrations, send out recall notices, and all of those types of things. We also have a bit of a cooperative federalism model that we see within other areas of environmental realm, which means that the federal government can set the standards and then states often will take over some of the enforcement duties themselves and have a state kind of enforcement office. But they don't need to, they can leave it all in the hands of the EPA. All right, so that's our federal realm. So what are the states doing? Well, stricter state and local regulation of pesticide use is permissible, right? So we have a 1991 case saying that it's okay for states to go stricter than FIFRA. What they cannot do is create a different labeling requirement. We do not want to have one label in California and another label in Colorado. We have one label nationwide, but the state could put in other restrictions on it. And so states have created their own rules. But belatedly so. It wasn't until 2014 that we see any funding in California, for example, on enforcement and compliance of environmental concerns. That's 18 years after legalization of medical marijuana. And this funding for kind of enforcement and regulation and monitoring environmental concerns for cannabis is still really low compared to any other agricultural industries in California. So despite it being one of the largest industries, agricultural industries in California, it's nowhere near the funding that you're going to get for even forestry, which is a relatively smaller proportion. And then some states haven't acted. You know, this is not a typical state realm. A lot of states don't have the expertise and the interest in kind of setting pesticide levels. And so they have just not. And then the states with the most robust laws in this area, unsurprising, are California, Oregon, Colorado. I'll talk a little bit about them in some of my examples here. But states haven't created the rules, and that follows other environmental, agricultural, and land use rules for cannabis. States often legalize before they work out the details, right? It is particularly true where legalization comes via a referendum. So we're playing catch up with our environmental laws, kind of struggling to figure out what they should be after we already have a legalized marketplace. And then when states do have pesticide regulations, they adopt really different rules and approaches. First, they have different standards for determining whether a pesticide can be used. One approved in Oregon may not be approved in California. Colorado asks different questions than California does, for example. Colorado says, is it one of these ones that's been exempt? Or is it something that's already been approved for tobacco or human consumption? California changes that a little bit, and they do not allow any restricted pesticides. And they also have a list of ones that are based on their groundwater concerns that you can't use. So you can see, you know, we're going to end up with different lists in different states. So pesticide you can use one place, you can't use somewhere else. So what the states have done largely is publish a list of acceptable pesticides. California's list is 66, Oregon's is 59. I can't remember Colorado's right now. All right, but even once you have that list of pesticides, you still got to get your second question of what should the residue levels be? What are our tolerance levels? And in Oregon, for their whole list of 59, they just set the same level, right? There was no nuance there. Right? Even though intuitively we realized there probably should be a difference. And in California, they did two. So there's one for like inhaling products that you're going to inhale have one level of pesticide tolerance, and ones that you consume in all other forms have a different one. Now, just for an example, outside of the United States, we can look to Canada. Canada has 96 pesticides, so more than any of our states. And in general, each of their standards is stricter than what we have. All right, I just have a couple more thoughts for you. I wanted to share with you kind of some cases and controversies to be aware of. One is that we have had some consumer cases, right? So the Eagle 20 there is a pesticide that was used a lot in Colorado. It's called myclobutanil, but you can see why I like to call it Eagle 20 instead. And it pesticide used in a lot of agricultural industry. Unfortunately, when you burn it, it breaks down to hydrogen cyanide. So it was okay perhaps on an apple or something like that, but not on a product that you burn it to consume, right? So a lot of consumers were upset about this, understandably, and they brought a lawsuit. They could not prove that they had, in fact, suffered a harm. So they made it a consumer kind of business law lawsuit about pricing information, arguing I would not have paid so much for this marijuana had I known what it really contained. But unfortunately, the case was tossed out for lack of standing because they were bringing a commercial claim, but they had no intention to buy more or to resell it. So, but we should still feel pretty good about it because it is what led to Colorado getting pretty serious about their pesticide regulations there. A more recent case just last year, so still ongoing, and I'm not sure where it's at, I should have checked it this morning, is a use of paclobutrazol in Los Angeles, found in some of the dispensaries in Los Angeles, and it is a restricted use pesticide. If you remember, California doesn't allow any restricted use pesticides. So we see their arguments based on public nuisance and unfair competition. So I'm really interested, they're not using kind of FIFRA type laws. There's no citizen suit in FIFRA, but instead they're kind of bringing these consumer laws, which is kind of interesting. Two other things I wanted to let you know about that we could definitely talk about. One is about worker exposure. This is the area there's probably the least studies about. There's almost nothing. And we have to think not just about growing and kind of typical agricultural work, but the trimming. Marijuana trimming is usually done by hand, and there's not anybody really studying what type of exposure these people are getting. A 2018 survey of cannabis workers in Colorado found that 35% of them reported adverse health symptoms after handling the pesticides. But I think this is the one I really want you to know about. It's a really recent study out of Oregon that looked at all of the cannabis that had failed the state testing. So the state had done a bunch of sampling and had found some that had failed. And so then these researchers at Oregon State kind of like, well, what's failing and why? And what I mean by that is they were violating some rule of the pesticide regulations in Oregon. What did they find? They found 50 different pesticides being used, pesticide residues, I should say. There could be more being used, but there was 50 residues that they found on the cannabis. And only 3 of those were on the list of 59 approved by Oregon. 3 of them were extremely hazardous, 6 highly hazardous, 2 moderately, 4 slightly, and only 15 were non-hazardous. So pretty alarming types of pesticides. There was more pesticides found on recreational marijuana. In fact, 47% of recreational extracts were found to have some type of pesticide residue in them. But how much was found? Should we be worried? Were they really small levels? Well, the levels of pesticide found were higher for medicinal marijuana. So, and we should maybe be particularly worried there because people consuming medical marijuana may already be medically compromised. So there's definitely, I think, some alarm bells that should be going off for the industry of trying to figure out how we deal with these pesticides. The biggest problem here is that the federal status limits our ability to study these pesticides. If you think it's hard to get medical money and approval for medical studies, just imagine pesticide studies is a pretty low priority here. And there's so many different ways that people consume cannabis, right? You can think of kind of, there's the edibles and there's the oils, and all of those are should have different tolerance levels. And then heating can change the process, as we saw. And also toxicologists are often lamenting the problems here because they say, look, there's so many active ingredients. This is this already starts off as a harder product to study because of all the interactions and all the complicated compounds involved and all the different strains available. We also know there's an expansion coming, right? California currently caps farms at 1 acre. That's going to be expanded in 2023. There's a lot of things that we should be thinking about. So here's my last slide just to end us off with some thoughts for further conversation. One is that maybe we should be looking to Canada as a starting point, just to replicate what they have there. Maybe we should be thinking about private governance. You know, we can't use organic, but USDA, right? So federal organic standards aren't going to work. Maybe there's some private governance that can help us out here. I have a lot of thoughts on that. And also just thinking about descheduling. I know we often are preaching descheduling of marijuana, but I think it could be really tricky from a pesticide question, right? Right now, I mean, maybe it seems great because then we have a lot of these are going to come under kind of environmental regulatory schemes and we're going to have oversight. But also the pesticide regulation process is really slow and expensive, and it would cause a huge hiccup in the industry. From an environmental standpoint, I might be fine with that, but from a medical standpoint, I might be worried about what that would mean about delivery of product to people who really need it. And moreover, we should be pretty concerned also if it pushes people into an illegal product, because we know those harms are even greater. So, so what should we do? I don't know, and I would welcome your thoughts and suggestions. All right, thank you guys.
Oh, sorry, just eating an apple.
What's on that apple, Jay?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm gonna throw it away. Thank you so much, Jess, for that presentation. It's going to make me think differently about eating that. Now, for our next presentation, Ryan Stoa, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Jay. And thanks for organizing this wonderful conference, and the panels I've been able to sit in on or view virtually have been wonderful. I saw the speaker lineup. I thought this was truly an amazing cast of speakers, and I was just so honored to be a part of this conference and to be able to hopefully contribute in some small way. And when I saw my fellow panelists, I was equally enthusiastic and excited to be on this panel with them. Like Jessica, I've relied on the work of my fellow panelists and sort of understanding the issues facing the cannabis industry, particularly environmental issues facing that industry. So I was really excited not just to be a part of this conference, but to be a part of this panel. And so I thank my panelists for doing this with me, and Jay for inviting us to do this panel together. So I want to think about social equity or fairness issues and challenges facing cannabis agriculture and the cannabis agriculture industry. And I think this is one thing I often try to impress upon folks interested in the cannabis industry is that this is a really incredible opportunity that we don't see in a lot of other industries. You know, we often lament the state of American agriculture, and we note how difficult it is to change the status quo, and particularly entrenched interests that benefit from the status quo. And here we have an opportunity as a country and as individuals in our states to really promote the future that we want to see, to craft the cannabis industry into the industry that we want it to be. In many cases, legislatures are, as in by far the most number of states, legislatures are developing their rules and regulations towards cannabis agriculture in response to ballot initiatives by the people. So it's not as if legislatures are spending years researching in this area and have the sophisticated program in place. A lot of times we find that they're scrambling. And when they're scrambling, it often seems like agriculture gets kind of lost in the shuffle. Jay sort of mentioned at the beginning that environmental issues often get overlooked. I would say agricultural issues in general often are overlooked. I think policymakers are often quite eager to think about taxation issues, or to think about retail sales, public health concerns, land use and zoning type of issues. But there's often less awareness of the agricultural dimension of the cannabis industry. And after all, this is a plant and it's commercially produced, making that an agricultural process. And even that, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about. When the state of New York first passed its medical marijuana law, it referred to the process of creating cannabis as manufacturing, which I think showed a little bit of sort of, again, misunderstanding of what this process really looks like, and really how I think it should be thought of, which really is agriculture. And I just want to say at the outset, echoing Jessica, there's still one of the really interesting aspects of this industry is the evolving nomenclature and terminology. I too started, when I was first doing research in this area, was primarily using the word marijuana, and then advocacy groups or farming advocacy groups in particularly California started encouraging me to use the word cannabis, because it's sort of evokes a more professional perspective on the industry. And then I also heard, folks, and I think Jessica alluded to this, sort of say, well, let's honor the historic roots of this word. This originates as a Hispanic word, came from Mexico into the United States. Why be ashamed of that history or embarrassed of that history or look away from that history? Let's embrace that. In our first panel, we had, and this is the first time I heard this perspective. One of the doctors on the panel argued that we should do away with the word recreational. That recreational sort of insinuates that people who don't have a medical marijuana license aren't using it for medicinal purposes, or that this isn't a medicinal plant, or are a consumption product that has a medicinal component. And then finally, I think, especially in thinking about equity issues, there's been a strong movement in place for many areas of the cannabis industry to stop using the word black market and to think instead in terms of using the word illicit market, sort of tying that word black to a community of people that were hit hardest in the war on drugs and now continue to be tied to it to an extent by using that sort of black market terminology. Jay mentioned I published my book on the cannabis industry in November of 2018, largely wrote it in 2016 and 2017, and I sort of look back and cringe when I use that phrase, black market. So I think it's, I also go back and forth between marijuana and cannabis, but I think it's interesting to sort of be thoughtful about and think about at least the terminology that we're using. So I'm breaking up my presentation into sort of three parts. I'm going to think about sort of on the highest level, equity issues in terms of the structure of the industry and how it's organized in sort of the largest sense. I'm then going to move into a discussion of state licensing schemes. And if you teach administrative law or you're an admin law nerd like I am, then you'll really like that section. And third, I'm going to think about inclusion and the ways in which agriculture can be as participatory as possible and encourage fair labor standards. So let's get started. I think it's fair to say, in thinking about and looking at the cannabis industry, that that there are a lot of dualities in terms of how this industry might shape. There's a lot of this or that, and I'm going to talk about a few of those. I'm going to talk about indoor versus outdoor agriculture. I'm going to talk about sort of big marijuana farms versus small marijuana farms or family farms versus at-home grows. I'm going to talk about the idea that we might see a generic commodity come out of this industry versus unique strains being sort of the dominant product model. And then I'll touch briefly on marijuana versus hemp and whether or not states might need to think about striking the right balance, an equitable balance between marijuana and hemp farming regions. So let's get into that. Here's a picture, perhaps you all have seen something similar to this. On the left, this is a picture of an indoor warehouse grows, pretty typical. And on the right, again, a typical sort of outdoor farm. One of the things I try to emphasize when we're talking about the cannabis industry is if you're talking about agriculture and production, it's important to clarify which approach you're talking about. Are you talking about indoor or are you talking about outdoor? And I think even our panel today, to me, highlights kind of that contrast. There's I think when I think about pesticides and the impacts that those have, I think that problem or that challenge is probably most pronounced with respect to outdoor farms, just because those pesticides end up in the ground and then they run off when it rains into sort of sensitive riparian habitats. Certainly still a concern for indoor grows as well, but I think it's particularly acute with respect to outdoor farms. And we hear from Gina talk about, Professor Warren talk about, energy use and the massive energy consumption required by the cannabis industry. They were talking about indoor grows. And so I think, perhaps the way Joe Biden would put this is that there's currently a battle for the soul of the cannabis industry in the United States. And it's been fascinating to me that watching over the last 3 years that these two sort of communities, rivals in a way, are both seem to be doing quite well. And it seems like perhaps the takeaway, at least so far, is that there is a role for both agricultural approaches. Certainly there's sort of pros and cons and benefits to each approach. For indoor agriculture, I think that the primary benefit is control. If you're a cultivator, you're growing these plants, and you're growing them indoors, you get to control almost everything. You control the temperature, the moisture content in the air, the water that the plants receive, the type of soil and how much soil. You can very easily manipulate the lighting scheme, and you can protect them from wind and rain and wildlife. Whereas with outdoor agriculture, you cede an incredible amount of that control, right? You don't get to control how humid the air is. You don't get to get to control when it rains, how cold it is, if there's a frost, if a deer runs through your crop. But the primary benefit, I think, relative to indoor agriculture is that for outdoor farms, you take advantage of a free energy source, that being the sun. And that's a massive cost savings. And you know, we could get into I think people do a hotly debate the sort of future of outdoor versus indoor, and there's sort of very, very opinionated folks and strong adherence to one approach or the other. But it's something to keep in mind when we're thinking about cannabis agriculture is to remember to think about what type of method or are we talking about when it comes to indoor versus outdoor. I also spend a lot of time thinking about when it comes to this industry, big versus small. Is the cannabis industry inevitably going to become dominated by a few very large farms that produce a sort of cheap commodity that floods the market and drives small scale farmers out of business on the one hand? Or is it going to continue to be dominated by small scale operations, perhaps local operations and sort of smaller grows that produce a diversity and a variety of products? And I think, you know, a few years ago, you started seeing, you know, when legalization started to gain momentum, started seeing a lot of headlines to the effect of, you know, the big marijuana takeover is here. And I think there's this sense that that's kind of inevitable, and there will not be a role for the small scale or artisanal or craft producer. And one of the things I've been sort of pushing back on over the last few years is that there is a role. I'm not saying that there will not be large farms. I think the sort of analog that we discussed in a previous panel is sort of the beer industry, where you've got your Bud Lights, but you also have your local craft brews. And I think there's a promising role for small scale farmers in that regard. And I think, you know, one reason is because there's sort of consumer demand for that. And I think a lot of people who consume cannabis sort of see themselves perhaps as connoisseurs, not just with different strains, but also growing locations. I also think this is currently, you know, for the most part, the status quo. And you have, because of the federal prohibition, you know, every state that legalizes needs to create its own sort of in-state crop, if you will, of cannabis producers. And because of that, when federal prohibition is lifted, there are going to be, I think, many more farms than we otherwise would have seen if that type of interstate commerce had been permissible. There's also some question about whether or not cannabis is going to become or marijuana is going to become one sort of generic strain. If you know, we often talk about marijuana as if it's one thing. But I think many of us know that it's in reality hundreds and even thousands of different genetically distinct strains. And so I think whether or not we see that commoditization will really influence, you know, is this going to be dominated by a few large farms that produce a commodity, or is it going to be dominated by small farms that create, you know, their own unique mix of strains? And so far, I think you see support for both. I mean, certainly there are a lot of consumers that are price sensitive and want, you know, the cheapest, most potent product possible. There's also a lot of consumers that want that variety, and I think would like to see a diversified marketplace. Finally, I think one thing that goes kind of under the radar a little bit when we see this cannabis legalization across the country, the focus, I think, is on psychoactive marijuana strains, because that's really where the money is right now. But it's also, many states are simultaneously legalizing then the non-psychoactive production of hemp. However, one of the problems from an equity point of view is that there are reasons to believe that psychoactive marijuana and non-psychoactive hemp should not be grown side by side. And the reason for that is cross-pollination. Cannabis marijuana is a dioecious plant, meaning there are males and females. And in order to produce these buds that we sort of like in the marijuana market or consume, you have to separate the males from the females so that they don't pollinate the females and add a bunch of seeds that consumers don't want. The problem is that pollen from male plants appears to be able to travel over pretty significant distances. So if you had a marijuana farm next to a hemp farm, there's a decent chance that the hemp plants would pollinate the female marijuana plants, and you'd end up with a really low quality marijuana product. But the flip side of that might also be true that a male marijuana plant might pollinate a female hemp plant, and you'd end up with a hemp product that has too much THC in it for it to be legally qualified or sold as hemp. And so states are, I think, not yet recognizing the problem or the challenge with this. I think in Oregon, you've seen some investigation. They have both hemp farmers and marijuana farmers, and there's been some collaboration trying to think about where does it make sense to grow each of these crops, but that might require a little bit of thought moving forward into the future. So I'm going to move then to the sort of second phase of my presentation and thinking about state licensing. I know this is not like, this doesn't come across perhaps as the sort of sexiest aspect of cannabis legalization, but I think the way in which a state sets up its agricultural licensing framework has a huge influence on whether or not people in that state consider it to be fair and inclusive and participatory. And so far in the United States, and I'm simplifying here, but so far in the United States, we've seen really kind of two models that states have taken when it comes to issuing licenses for cultivators. One of those models is sort of the California model. We've seen this in a number of states where they're not necessarily going to cap the number of licensed producers. You simply have to sort of meet licensing requirements and submit an application for a permit. And if you meet those needs, then you will or should receive a license. And that was deliberate on the part of California when they were thinking about their legalization laws, which should look like. Current Governor Newsom, former Lieutenant Governor, explicitly said, we want to spread the benefits around. Legalization is controversial, and if we are going to go down this path, let's make sure that as many Californians benefit from it as possible. The alternative approach that you see in states such as Ohio, Florida, initially New York, is that they severely limit the number of cultivators that have a license from the state to grow or produce cannabis. And the appeal of that from the state's perspective is pretty obvious, right? In California, there's estimated to be over 70,000 cannabis farms. Many of those are pretty small scale, but 70,000 is a lot of farms to have to regulate, and most of them do not have a permit or a license. Whereas, when the state of Florida, for example, legalized medical marijuana, they issued initially licenses to 12 pretty well-financed and politically connected cultivation companies. Well, that's a lot easier to regulate and oversee 12 growing operations as opposed to 70,000. So it makes some sense for the state. It sort of eases the burden. Of course, the problem with that, the trade-off, is that you're not creating that inclusive or participatory model. You're not allowing people to participate. Most of those businesses we've seen across states are, as I mentioned, sort of very financed. They often don't include people of color or benefits for communities that were hit the hardest in the war on drugs. And they're sort of criticized for that. And they, because there's sort of such a limited amount of producers, the illicit market continues to thrive. So this is a map on the left of the state of Ohio and the location of its initially licensed cultivators in the state. There are only 12. Ohio was controversial because during their legalization process, during their movements, they initially one of the legalization initiatives that ended up failing included 12 cultivators that would have been written into their state constitution. So it wasn't just that the state agencies were going to give them an oligopoly, but that oligopoly would have been written into the constitution of the state itself. That ended up failing, I think, a large reason because of that lack of participation and inclusion. The opposite route of sort of being more inclusive, again, requires probably a lot more effort, a lot more resources from the state, but I think it does, and I sort of advocate for that approach because not just from an inclusion point of view and to sort of spread those benefits around, I think it's probably good for the markets as well to have a diversity of products and farming regions. So on the right of your screen, this is a map of that was produced by the Cannabis Appellations Project. So the idea of having cannabis appellations is somewhat new. When I included a chapter on it in my book, I had a lot of people at first thinking that this was silly and it had no chance of taking root. Appellations you probably are familiar with in the wine industry. It's a sort of certified designation of origin on an agricultural product that communicates to the consumer that that product that claims to be from a certain place in the world really is from that place in the world. So if you see a bottle of wine that says Napa Valley on it, you can be sure that a certain percentage of the grapes that were grown and contained in that wine actually do come from Napa Valley. And there's different ways, different sort of appellation models. In the United States, our wine appellation model only tells you the sort of location or the geographic origin of the wine, whereas the French appellation model also contains sort of quality standards. And I'll say, well, you can, if you want to be part of this appellation, if you want to put the appellation name on your label, and increase the value of that product accordingly, you have to limit yourself to growing these type of grapes, and you have to harvest by this date, and you can only use these pesticides, and so on and so forth. So there's pros and cons to both approaches. In the last couple of years, the California Department of Agriculture showed an interest and put together a working group to think about and think through some of these appellation issues, culminating last year in the sort of public release of rules and regulations to establish an appellations program for the cannabis industry in California. And I think this is a welcome development. This will further protect sort of local growing regions. It'll ensure that farmers in Humboldt County are not driven out of business by a large warehouse grow in Ohio, because that warehouse grow is not going to be able to advertise itself as sort of Humboldt County cannabis, or at least it should not if enforcement takes place. And so it really means that there's a different product. You're not necessarily competing for the same consumers. You're not necessarily producing the same product. And so it creates, I think, a protection there for farming regions and agricultural regions that I think really many states should find attractive, particularly when the federal prohibition is lifted. You see this interstate commerce start to flood states with cannabis across state lines. One of the issues facing an appellations program, this makes sense in California because there's a lot of outdoor grow. There's evidence that cannabis does have a terroir, so to speak. Terroir is a word for the characteristics that an agricultural product exhibits based on where it was grown. So wine connoisseurs could taste a Napa Valley wine and maybe identify some aspects of that wine that suggest it really was grown there. And there is initial, albeit we need a lot more research on this. There's initial evidence that that's true of cannabis as well, as long as it was grown outside, of course. Less true, perhaps not true at all, if we're talking about indoor cultivation. So that's something I think that states will need to think about as well in this sort of debate between indoor and outdoor cultivation. Finally, I think we need to, the agricultural industry for cannabis currently needs to spend or continue to spend time thinking about the people that make up the industry, where the benefits are going, and how I think labor standards can be made fair and equitable. So thinking first about business owners. Again, I've criticized and continue to sort of criticize the approach that some states take in doling out, just a dozen licenses to a few very well-financed firms that did not have any sort of history with the prior war on drugs, that are not diverse in any way, and simply have really nice political connections. Other states, I think, are doing a better job being thoughtful about trying to spread those benefits around in an equitable way. So some states, for example, California, will provide some preferential treatment. This is somewhat debatable, but in theory, will provide some preferential treatment to legacy growers, growers that can show that they've been growing for a long time, that they've been committed, and that they sort of already exist. They're not sort of out-of-staters coming in with a bunch of cash and dreams of cashing in on the green rush. There are some states, such as Massachusetts, that are promoting or providing preferential treatment and licensing to justice applicants, to applicants for cultivation licenses that are coming from the communities that were hit the hardest by the war on drugs, those being low-income communities and communities of color. There are some states that are providing preferential licensing to artisanal producers or to producers that can show that they are growing sustainably. I think states need to do more of this. And I think all states should be thinking about who they want to see in the industry and try to spread those benefits around so that we don't just have a dozen licensed producers in the state and all those benefits challenging to very few a number of people, but rather to use the incredible revenues generated by the cannabis industry, and particularly cannabis legalization, to start to right some of the wrongs of the prior era on prohibition, to try to craft the sort of cannabis agriculture industry that we want to see. I think finally, one thing that often gets overlooked, and I think there's starting to be more of a conversation about who business owners are in the cannabis industry. I mentioned so Massachusetts issuing licenses to justice applicants, for example. But rarely do you hear about sort of people who work for growing operations or farms and sort of their interests and their needs. And I'm talking particularly here about trimmers. Every year in the cannabis industry, particularly sort of months August, September, October, November, huge influx of temporary laborers that travel to growing operations or farms in California, for example, in order to trim. And when you sort of get when you harvest a marijuana plant, you have to sort of buck it down, you have to dry it, and then you need trimmers to trim away the stems and the leaves, and in some cases the seeds, in order to make it ready and that sort of produce that sort of beautiful bud that consumers want to purchase. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of protections for trimmers. For the most part, this still remains, a lot of trimmers are paid in cash, which I think that, there can be some mutual benefit to that. Certainly, this is an industry that still traffics in cash for the most part. But they're paid in cash, they're not sort of documented workers. Many, particularly in California, many trimmers will come up from Central or South America on sort of a tourist visa, trim for a few months, and that'll be the sort of income that they generate for the rest of the year, for the most part. So it can be very beneficial, and I think it's good to see that that sort of intermingling, if you will, of people from around the world coming to the United States to participate in our cannabis agriculture industry. But I think we also need to recognize that trimmers, they're sort of lowest on the totem pole in terms of workers on a cannabis farm. And they're often women, often people of color. And depending on the farm, some farms treat their trimmers wonderfully, others do not. And I think states need to think about in sort of moving forward with legalization, how do we create an equitable situation for not just the business owners, but also everyone involved in the production of cannabis. And I was really pleased to hear Jessica articulate one concern, and that is their exposure to the pesticides that are contained in the buds that they're trimming. They're spending hours and hours and hours all day long, all night long trimming. They're paid usually, almost always, per pound that they trim, so they have an incentive to just keep going and keep going and keep going. And so that exposes them to those pesticides. I've heard some horror stories of farms where the trim scene was 20 or 30 people, and it was outside with no bathroom facilities whatsoever. Everyone just had to figure it out on their own every time they had to go. Some states, some counties are being thoughtful about this, and they're sort of saying, well, you got to comply with the labor standards we have for other industries as well. And that sort of raises some sort of secondary issues about, well, is it really realistic right now to try to fit the cannabis industry into all our existing regulations for agriculture, or do we need agricultural regulations that are specifically tailored to the cannabis industry? And I think in some states or counties where they're thinking about, you know, workers and sort of fair working conditions, it seems like they're not really taking that tailored approach. They're thinking about this from the perspective of other industries. And I think that that's presenting some challenges and making it hard for people to comply and really come up with an equitable solution for both farmers and business owners and the trimmers that really make a lot of this happen. So those are just some big picture issues that I'm thinking about in terms of fairness and equity in cannabis agriculture. Thanks again, Jay, and to my co-panelists, Jessica and Gina.
Thank you so much for that, Ryan. Super interesting. Our next speaker will be Gina Warren. Just turn it over to her.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me be a part of this panel. As the previous panelists have said, I've felt very privileged to be among this group, and frankly, it was exciting for me when Jay contacted me because I hadn't considered any of this for quite some time. And I am, as Jessica said about herself, I don't really think about marijuana a ton. I think about energy and climate a lot. And so my background is, as I was working, when I was practicing law, I worked for a big utility company in Seattle. And so in around 2015 or so, I was talking to some of the folks that I used to hang out with there, and they were saying, you know, we're not really sure what we're going to do about this whole marijuana thing. And I said, what are you talking about? And then they started telling me about their concerns with some of the energy and some of the issues. And so that's why I originally started looking into this in 2015, but really hadn't picked it back up since then. So this was a great opportunity for me to, I've been sitting in on some of the panels and thinking about it. And so I was kind of excited about some of the changes that have been made, and then also kind of sad that some of the changes haven't really been made yet. And so let's take a look at what we've done so far. So this is my biggest question that I had as I was researching this is, okay, well, how much electricity does indoor cultivation require? And the answer is I have no idea. I know that it's a lot, but I really don't know how much. And the reason I don't know how much is because we still are failing to study it adequately, right? So we know we've got some numbers and some old numbers too. So we have like, you know, it's $6 billion annually. Well, that number was actually from 2014, I believe. So who knows what it is now. We had numbers where it was 1% of all US consumption. And then in Denver in particular had around 4% or 3% of their entire energy generation was going to marijuana, indoor marijuana facilities. But the honest answer is I don't know how much. And this is something that needs to be addressed to where we need to really have a better understanding of exactly how much electricity is going toward indoor cultivation. And, you know, like Ryan said, one of the issues that I don't address in this presentation, I have it a little bit in a previous paper that I wrote, but there is this conflict between indoor and outdoor cultivation. And a lot of times people will just say, well, just shift to growing outdoor and then you don't have to worry about electricity consumption. And just simply, it's just not that simple. As Jessica and Ryan pointed out earlier, I mean, there's pros and cons to that. And in fact, at the moment, most of the states are requiring indoor cultivation, their state requirements anyway. So really, this is a current problem, and even if things shift to outdoor at some point more than indoor, then that could change things. But at the moment, this is what's going on. I tried to find some great numbers for you again. It was a little bit difficult, but if you think about by sector, it appears that the marijuana industry is one of the most energy intensive industries in the United States. I saw some statistics that said it was about the same as data centers. I saw some that maybe it wasn't. It's still unclear. We do know that by commercial buildings, it's a lot more, so about 70 times that of a regular commercial building. And then we also know that this amount is projected to increase, and somewhere around 162%. I saw everywhere but between like 150% to 180%, I think, or something like that. So a lot, right? So a lot. So 5,000 square foot facility, we're seeing that uses about 66 times more energy than the average household, 70% more, somewhere around in that area. And the areas of energy intensity are probably pretty obvious, right? So a lot of lighting. Statistics were showing, again, some of them I saw were anywhere from between 36% and 68% of the energy that's being used for indoor cultivation was going toward lighting. So a really large portion of it. And then you also have moisture control, humidity control, and so dehumidifying and humidifying from that moisture control, and then also a lot of HVAC and temperature control, either cooling or heating for that. So those are those main buckets of areas for energy intensity for indoor cultivation, which are probably not a huge surprise, right? When you see the photos, that a lot of lighting, a lot of air, a lot of ventilation. And then obviously I'm focusing on this for electricity and energy, but you can imagine the water consumption as well in some of the other areas. And so as I was thinking about this, I was thinking that what it really raises to me are two immediate concerns with electricity demand and energy demand. And the first one is this concern with grid vulnerability. And the grid is getting strained in certain parts of the country that have high cultivation, indoor cultivation. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. And then greenhouse gas emissions, obviously at the top of anyone who's studying energy and climate, those are our main concerns as we're moving forward. So first, let's talk about grid vulnerability. I felt at some level that this was all anecdotal. There were a lot of reports by utilities, especially up in Oregon, California, and some in Washington, with regard to problems with blackouts, that they are at least considering that those had to do with a 24-hour firm energy demand by the growing number of marijuana indoor cultivators. And so there was this concern that because the cultivators require 24-hour firm power, so it has to always be running, and it's continuing to put pressure on the amount of energy that can be delivered. And frankly, we don't have necessarily the greatest energy grid in the world anyway, right? So our energy grid is pretty antiquated. We've done a lot in recent years to try to bring it into the 21st century and have smart grid technologies and better energy delivery systems. but it's still very antiquated in some parts of the country. And so this is really putting a lot of strain and has caused some blackouts, in particular in Oregon and California. And then there are a couple of reports that I saw with regard to having to change out infrastructure sooner than what they were anticipating, and that raises the cost. And so when you're thinking about having to change out transformers across a certain section of the United States, it's pretty expensive over time. And then obviously that money, that cost gets passed down to the rate base, the consumers, you and I. And then even, so a lot of times we think about this from a commercial perspective. So it's the commercial growers, but actually one of the things that's becoming more and more concerning is from an energy perspective is the number of people who are growing their own plants indoors. So if you grow indoor, right? I've always loved this shot, but basically if you grow about 4 plants indoors, that's the equivalent of running 29 refrigerators 24/7. And so even if it's on a small scale, you can imagine the overarching implications of energy delivery in the United States if people are doing it, if this is just increasing. So, and also, I mean, I talk about it from the perspective of the utility that's trying to deliver electricity, but it's also important to think about from the grower's perspective, because one of the most important things for indoor cultivators is having firm electricity delivery. And so if that electricity goes down or the transformers go down, that's really bad for business and really bad for the plants. And so grid vulnerabilities is certainly one big bucket of concern. The other one is the obvious, is the greenhouse gas emissions. So just as a little bit of background for that, the greenhouse gas emissions from the US electricity grid, so the electricity portion, is about 32% of the total US related CO2 emissions. So you have all of the different sectors, you have the transportation and industry and electricity sectors, but of those, electricity is about 32%. So about a third of the US generated CO2 emissions come from electricity. And that's because our electricity grid in the United States is still majority fossil fuels. Now, we have made major strides in this regard because when I first started teaching in energy law about 10 years ago, I guess, this was not even close to this. I think we were around 80% fossil fuels in the United States. So we really have increased our renewables and clean energy. So I always put nuclear in the clean energy when I'm talking about greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking about nuclear and renewables, those are your clean energy sources. And then the fossil fuels, we have reduced our reliance on coal, but we have also increased our reliance on natural gas through the years. So we're around 61% fossil fuels, and this is the total US grid. But if you think about, you have to also look at it from the state perspective. And so from a state perspective, if you take Colorado, for instance, I don't know exactly what it is today, but it's probably around 75%. And a lot of their reliance is on coal and natural gas. Massachusetts also has a pretty high reliance on natural gas. And so even places you might think that might be a little bit greener are still have a decent amount of reliance on fossil fuels. And so anytime you're burning fossil fuels, you're increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And, obviously I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it from a global perspective, because we're in the world. And so you can see that the United States per capita consumption of energy and electricity is already much higher than most of the other places in the world. And so I think that this map was showing that the only place that was higher than us per capita is Saudi Arabia here. And it was only by a very, very small amount. So per capita, we already use a huge amount of electricity and energy. And so we're already generating a lot of greenhouse gas emissions just without even adding any new industries that are going to continue that. And so, you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has said we have to keep our percentage degree changes down to like 1.5 and absolutely no more than 2, or it's going to be relatively devastating. And they say, this is how you do it. And they say you decrease energy demand and you lower emissions from energy demand, and you actively remove from the atmosphere, and you fully decarbonize the electricity sector. And so you can see of the 6 recommendations that the IPCC has, 3 of those are related to energy, lowering our demand, and then fuel switching to clean energy requirements. And so this is where I come at the marijuana industry, is just thinking about what impacts that the industry might have on our already concerning situation for energy in the world, really. And so this is one of the latest predictors, and it's saying basically this is your electricity demand growth, that even without, so this is marijuana is the green, so cannabis cultivation is the green, data centers is the yellow, electric vehicles is the red, and then the blue is just basic demand. And you can just see how our basic demand is growing, and then stacking on top of that is the cannabis cultivation. And so when I first started thinking about this, I said, well, what can we do? We have a new industry. What are some of the things that we might want to think about? And so I published this article in 2015, and it was really fun to think about because at the time, there were 4 states that had legalized marijuana. And so I was thinking, if I can just encourage these 4 states to think about ways to put in their licensing something to do with energy and climate and efficiencies and stuff, maybe that would help. In fact, though, none of them did. And I actually was contacted by 3 of these 4 states as people were trying to get some new licensing set up to think about it, but it didn't end up passing in any of these 3 states. So, so at the time, what I was thinking was mandate clean energy, seemed like a no-brainer to me, through state licensing schemes, and then paying a carbon tax if you weren't able to reach that. So say if you could only do 75% renewables, then you could pay some sort of a carbon fee on a sliding scale, depending on what that was, to make up for it. So that was what I really, it was an attempt to be modest about it and really think about it from, we just need the states to start thinking about incorporating renewable energy requirements into their licensing scheme. So, so the one model that was really one of the better ones that I saw, and I reached out to the person who runs this, and I had spoken to him in 2015, and I spoke to him again here this last week. And this seems to be one of the better opportunities in the US that has come out of this type of recommendation and thinking about it from a licensing perspective. And so in Boulder, and it's this Boulder County and Boulder City, they have this combination of requirements. So not at the Colorado state level, but at the local level. So they have a requirement that the marijuana industry, the indoor cultivators, have to offset their electricity use with renewable energy, or they have to pay a fee. And And then they also added, which I thought was interesting, they added a provision later that said, okay, so maybe you can't afford to pay this fee because of all the out-of-pocket costs. We will offset those costs. If you're putting money into a more efficient grid, then we'll offset that 2.1 cent per charge per kilowatt hour. And so I thought that was pretty thoughtful. The Boulder County, they have this fee that is paid. It goes into an offset fund. And the offset fund is intended to educate and to support the industry. They're doing a lot of data drives. They're doing the individual reports and talking to the certain cultivators and trying to help them figure out how to lower their electricity bills and electricity consumption. And so it seems to be a decent program. I received a report as to how it's going. They're definitely getting a lot of good information there. But the problem is it's localized, right? So it's only in Boulder and it's not statewide. And so then if you move forward to 2020, then when I started looking at it again, I was like, oh, so now we have 15 states plus DC who have fully legalized cultivation. And so I was like, oh, I'm excited. I want to see what the states have done. And you know what? 2 of them have done a decent job. And so I want to look at their state licensing requirements for Massachusetts and Illinois. And so let's look at them really fast here. So Massachusetts has a state licensing requirement. So part of the ability to receive a license in Massachusetts, they require cultivators to have operating plan that describes how they will achieve reduction of energy and increase efficiency, efforts that they're doing to work with the utility companies there to have increased incorporation of renewable energy. They also have a lighting power density requirement where it depends on how many square feet you're talking about, but it's anywhere between 36 and 50 watts per square foot. And then they have HVAC and building code requirements. And in fact, this statute is quite significant and it has a lot of information and a lot of requirements. And so they're really putting major effort into increasing efficiency for indoor growers through their licensing program, through their state licensing program in Massachusetts. Equally, in Illinois, the applicants have to provide an environmental plan to demonstrate that they're going to minimize carbon footprint. And they're going to, they have a very strict limit of electricity of no more than 36 watts per square foot. And they have to use high efficiency lighting and HVAC and other things. And also they have separate building code requirements that they have to go through as well. And there are reporting requirements. And so in Illinois, I think this is one of them that maybe Ryan was talking about, that I'm pretty sure that there's a set number of licenses that can be administered there, and you have to qualify and you have to do these things in order to qualify for the license. But both of these states have done, put forth a lot of effort to consider how much electricity efficiencies can go into place for indoor marijuana cultivators. And so it was nice and refreshing to see that a couple of states have actually looked at this. But as you see, there are a lot of states here on this list that have not. And so that's an area that's definitely lacking. So having these green energy efficiency standards are great, and I would encourage states to put those into their state licensing requirements. I think that that's probably the most effective way to address it at this point. But in addition to that, I was also heartened to see some, I see where my time is. I was heartened to, I'm probably, okay. So we have some state regulated utilities are starting to move toward really helping out some of the industry and working with them. And you know, when I first started looking at this in 2015, utilities were very concerned about supplying and allowing grants and incentives and surcharges for the industry because of this concern of it being illegal at the federal level, what that meant for them, and especially if they were receiving any kind of federal funding and things like that. But really, I mean, states are regulated, especially for the distribution and retail. States are utilities are regulated at the state, and so their money comes from the state rate makers, ratepayers, and so at least it appears that most utilities are starting to jump on the bandwagon of feeling like they can be able to, and even are probably mandated to supply firm power to indoor cultivators. And so just a couple ways that utilities are doing or helping out, or at least working in this direction. So they're offering some incentives for reductions in costs per kilowatt hour. Normally, I have a couple of examples I'll give you. And then one of them that was pretty impressive is Maine is offering some grants, and I'll look at those. And then I also this concept of a surcharge or extra charge or tax if you exceed a certain amount of consumption is also something that utilities can do and states can do. So just as a few examples of what's going on, there are lots of these. This is actually an area that has made a big difference, it appears. And there are also a lot of companies that are out there that work with the utility companies and the growers, and they try to get them connected with the incentives. And so it seems like there's a lot of work going on with regard to that. But like in California, there was a 45% tax on customers who use more than 60% of their energy consumption baseline, once they figure out whatever that baseline is. And so meaning there's a tax if you consume over a certain amount. So trying to encourage people and incentivize people to reduce that. Puget Sound Energy has incentives. So 20 cents per kilowatt hour for the first year savings, up to 100% of incremental cost of more efficient equipment. So types of incentives that the utilities are offering. Maine had the National Grid, Massachusetts, the National Grid was offering to defray about 75% of costs of study, which I think is extremely important, is to get the information that's needed for the studies. And then the one that I was talking about in Maine, they just reinstated that they will give grants to participants to defray 50% of the project's costs up to $1 million for LED lights, energy efficient HVACs and things like that. So a lot of utilities are considering incentive programs and working with indoor growers to try to reduce those some of those costs and to make it more efficient. So just to, I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and finish up here. So things to think about, while clearly are not going to solve all of the problems and address everything that needs to be addressed, just consider things to consider are shifting to clean energy requirements and mandates, carbon fees in through the state licensing requirements, overall reduction in electricity consumption. So thinking about policies, whether they're push policies or pull policies, to be able to incentivize more efficient electricity use and consumption. And then I think more than maybe anything, the need for audits and studies and the ability to see exactly what's going on and make sure that whatever needs to be done can be done to help both the industry and the electricity industry to be able to move forward for this. So that is what I have, and I think my time is up. So
Great. Thank you so much. I remember when, I remember when Massachusetts implemented that requirement in the initial draft regulations. There wasn't anything about environmental or energy stuff, and then there was one of the big comments that came in. One of the big changes from the draft regulation to the final regulation was an inclusion of some of these energy requirements. And I know the lighting requirement was pretty controversial. I think that was right, because especially some medical dispensaries were worried about having to retrofit their lighting, and so there was, but it remained, it made it into the law, and remains that way. And Kay Doyle, who is one of the Massachusetts commissioners who was on a previous panel, was one of the really led the environmental effort for Massachusetts. So thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. And so now we have about 10 minutes or 15 minutes for Q&A. If people are watching and have a question for any of the panel participants, please put it in the Q&A and I will relay it on to them. We do have a couple of questions. One question is a terminology question. I think Ryan brought up this terminology. Well, I guess Jesse did too. Personally, I try to use the word devil's lettuce whenever possible, but I often forget to, but it's something I'm working on. But the question is, do you think in a few years people will cringe from their use of the term illicit market rather than unpermitted market or traditional market? Is the question. Anybody on the panel have any thoughts about that question?
Yeah, I'll offer my quick take. I think it's a good point, something I hadn't yet considered, but I think it might pick up on a certain sentiment that certainly exists. I think, thinking particularly in the California context, which again has around, by some estimates, 70,000 different growing operations. There's been a lot of frustration with the licensing and application process in California. I think when legalization first occurred, a lot of growers actually were pretty excited to quote unquote go legal and to shift from sort of being on the illicit market to the legal market. And many of them tried, including many that I've talked to. And because California's process is pretty decentralized, needing to get approval from multiple different state agencies as well as local municipalities and county agencies, for a lot of those farmers, it's been a nightmare of a process. And although they had good intentions and went in trying to go legal, they ended up going back, it's on the illicit market, so to speak, and are sort of really frustrated and disillusioned with the process. And I think for them, that question maybe is would be compelling. They're sort of saying, look, it's not the illicit market. It's just because I couldn't, as a small farmer, go through the permitting process, but perhaps there are better approaches, better words to use, unpermitted maybe being one of them.
Anybody else on the panel have any thoughts you want to contribute to that? No. Yeah. No.
I would just say it's always tricky for me because I tend to use illegal market, but frankly, if I'm going to talk about like how they're following the environmental laws, they're all illegal because they're kind of uniformly bad about them. So it's a tricky word, and I had not realized it was so fraught. And you guys will have to help me figure out what I should be using instead. Then
we won't even know how to even start speaking about that question. I have another.
I was thinking.
So go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking about from my perspective, maybe licensed versus unlicensed would be more of, from a regulatory perspective. That's how we consider things that might take it out of the criminal field and make it either licensed or unlicensed.
Thank you. The next question comes from Robert Mikos, who the question is probably for Ryan, but of course anybody can chime in. Here's the question. Some states require vertical integration of cultivators, processors, retailers. From an agricultural perspective, e.g. the perspective of farmers, does this model make sense? And how should we handle social equity / minority participation when markets are segmented? For example, when farmers and processors and retailers are all independent. Should we have similar expectations for each segment? Do barriers in one spill over into others?
Yeah, so thanks to Professor Mikos for the question. I think first with respect to vertical integration there, what Robert's alluding to are some states that have required marijuana businesses to really perform all steps in the supply chain, to not only grow the plant, but to process it, turn it into whatever secondary products like edibles that they may want to use, and then to also sell it in a retail store. And the appeal from the state is pretty clear. It's the same reason that there's appeal in only issuing 12 cultivation licenses statewide. You limit the number of companies that you have to oversee and regulate. So it makes the regulatory burden much lower. But to the question, does this make sense for farmers? I think it makes no sense at all. I think there's little reason to believe that someone who has expertise in growing a plant also has expertise in designing a retail space and catering to consumers and for complying with those zoning laws. I think they're two very different skill sets, and I think there's been a lot of frustration in states that have required vertical integration. Sort of Colorado experimented with this for a while before moving away from it, and I suspect I would be surprised if the future of the cannabis industry is vertical integration of this way. I think states will continue to experiment with it. There's some regulatory appeal, but it doesn't make much sense from a market perspective. And then thinking about equity, I'll be honest, I hadn't really thought about that. Maybe I'm sort of too focused on the sort of agricultural process, and there I see kind of a lack of equity or inclusion. But I suppose it's possible that a state could look at this more holistically or from a bigger picture perspective and say, all right, well, we're not having a lot of success in sort of treating inclusion and participation in the agricultural dimension, but we are in the retail space. And so we are in a big picture sense using legalization to sort of right the wrongs of the war on drugs or to use it to meet other social values. So I think that's certainly possible, something I hadn't really considered. I guess my concern would be particularly in states where they don't have one centralized agency regulating the industry as a whole, but rather a bunch of different agencies regulating different aspects of the industry. Department of Agriculture regulating cultivators, and public health regulating consumers, and commerce regulating retail spaces. Maybe there'll be a diffusion of responsibility there, and nobody will really think about this equity issue. But I certainly think that it's possible that you could think about it in a bigger picture way than perhaps I have been.
Are there trends with respect to vertical integration? Are the states who are starting to legalize, I guess even for, not really for recreational, but for fairly recent medical states, are any of those, do you happen to know, requiring vertical integration, or have we moved?
I'm not sure what the most recent states have decided to do. I know that Colorado experimented with it initially. I think Washington did as well. California never has. And I think a lot of states have not either. I think a lot of the states that do the sort of 12 licenses or less approach, they will incorporate vertical integration as well. It's like you're getting both of those benefits now. There's only 12 businesses and they're doing all steps of production. So you're seeing that in some of those states. But otherwise, I don't, I think that's not where the future of the industry will be. At least personally, I hope it isn't.
Thank you. Another observer, Michael Cutler, asks how, and this could go for all the panelists, do you have any thoughts about how to balance equity access with energy efficiency costs? Of course, with higher energy efficiency requirements, the cost of participating in the industry grows. There's a balance there with equity. Any thoughts about how to go about doing that balance? It's one of many balances, of course, we have to do in cannabis policy, but interested in anybody's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it. I think it's important, and I really should have had something in there, and so I apologize for not doing that, because it is something that I had written down, and especially after Ryan's presentation, I was thinking about it even more. But it's almost a catch-22, right? So the more efficient the electricity is, the cheaper those costs are to actually run the business, right? So electricity costs right now for some of the growers are you know, is 68% can be from poor lighting choices. And so if you have good lighting choices, then you're going to reduce your electricity bill, and it will allow for easier access to for equity. But you're right about startup costs, right? So those are going to be expensive. And one way that we could address that is to think about the incentive programs that utilities might have for a lower income threshold, something. And you could also think about it from a state perspective of state grants for some of the facilities. And so I could think about it a little bit more, but I think it could be just very standard for what utilities a lot of times do, is provide rebates and incentives for lower income or someone who would qualify in that area. So it's definitely something to think about.
Anyone else want to jump in? Another question from Rob Mikos. This is probably for Gina. He asks, should states impose a special carbon tax or other energy regulations on cannabis producers when they don't impose the carbon tax or other regulations on all businesses? Is this just the only political feasible option we have now?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and one I have undoubtedly received many, many times as I've spoken about taxing the industry. And not to be too flippant about it, but I think everybody should be taxed for using too much electricity. I think that electricity is too inexpensive generally for the costs that we're doing and the harms that we're doing to the world. And so certainly the people who are using a lot of electricity should be paying for it. And so I would have no problem with that across the board. Why I talk about it specifically for marijuana is simply the fact that we're just starting to develop our state licensing licensings for marijuana growers, and it's just an opportunity. I see it as kind of like just an opportunity to try to do something and to actually make a little bit of a difference at this initial level. But should everybody be imposed a carbon tax for using too much electricity? Yes, I think so. But if we can get it in the licensing for our marijuana growers, I think that could at least help at some level as everyone is getting started. So.
Great. Thank you very much. I just thought I'd give one last, we have about a minute or so, or 2 minutes, if anybody on the panel has any questions or last comments, either for each other or just something they wanted to throw out there as a final thought. But if not, that's fine too. We could wrap it up. I want to thank the three great panelists for your presentations. That was a really terrific conversation. Thank you so much. For the rest, for those who are viewing at home, we have one panel left. It does not start until 2:30, so there's a 45-minute break. That 2:30 panel is on criminal justice reform. So I hope you'll tune into that. This I think, is my last opportunity to say anything to anyone because I'm not moderating that final panel. So thank you everybody so much for attending and for participating. It's been really, really fun and really informative. So thank you very much. And
thanks.
Everyone have a great weekend. Bye.
Thanks,
Jay.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Gina.
Yep.